In 43 years of television, Steve Harvey had seen it all. He'd watched families win fortunes and lose them in the same breath. He'd heard answers so ridiculous they became legendary, witnessed reunions that stopped time, and stood before audiences whose laughter could shake the rafters of any studio in America. But he had never, not once, fallen completely silent in the middle of a live taping because a child's voice had reached into his chest and stopped his heart cold. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, during what should have been just another episode. The studio lights hummed their familiar electric song. The audience buzzed with that particular energy that comes before cameras roll, a kind of collective anticipation wrapped in popcorn-scented air and the rustle of programs being folded and unfolded in nervous hands. Production assistants moved like shadows through the aisles, checking microphones, adjusting lights, making sure every detail was perfect for what everyone assumed would be another night of laughter, competition, and the kind of wholesome entertainment that had become Steve Harvey's signature. But television is a strange and unpredictable animal. Sometimes it captures lightning, sometimes it witnesses miracles, and sometimes rarely, but powerfully it becomes a window into the kind of moment that reminds us why we still gather around glowing screens, hoping to see something real. The contestant standing before Steve that afternoon was impossibly small, 7 years old, barely tall enough to see over the podium even with the wooden box placed beneath his feet. His name was Arjun, and he'd traveled 6,000 miles from a village outside Mumbai to stand on that stage, his chef's hat slightly too large, tilting forward over eyes that held more gravity than any child's eyes should hold. His hands, small and careful, rested on the edge of the podium as if anchoring himself to something solid in a world that had suddenly become very large and very bright. The question had been simple. Routine, even. The kind of question designed to be funny, to generate the sort of unexpected answers that would make audiences laugh and shake their heads and share clips on social media the next morning. Steve had asked it with his trademark grin, that smile that had become as familiar to American households as Sunday morning coffee. But Arjun's answer when it came, delivered in a voice so quiet the sound engineer had to boost the levels twice, wasn't funny at all. The studio didn't erupt in laughter. No one hit their buzzers. The audience, 300 people strong, simply stopped breathing. You could hear it if you listened closely to the recording later, the way silence has its own sound, a kind of sacred hush that falls over a room when something holy is happening and no one wants to disturb it. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their operators frozen behind their lenses, fingers hovering over zoom controls they'd forgotten how to operate. And Steve Harvey, the man who'd built a career on never being at a loss for words, stood there with his mouth slightly open, his microphone lowering slowly to his side as if it had become too heavy to hold. His eyes, those expressive eyes that had laughed through 1,000 punchlines, were suddenly bright with something else entirely, something that looked like recognition. Or maybe it was grief. Or perhaps it was that rare and precious thing that happens when you suddenly understand that you're not hosting a show anymore. You're witnessing a moment that will outlive the cameras, the lights, and every manufactured second of entertainment you've ever produced. The teleprompter kept scrolling. The commercial break was scheduled for 2 minutes and 30 seconds from that moment. But time had stopped obeying the rules of television production, and everyone in that studio knew it. What had the child said? What words could possibly carry that much weight? To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to go back 3 months earlier, to a kitchen that existed in 2 worlds at once. In Mumbai, in a neighborhood where the streets were narrow and the buildings leaned into each other like old friends sharing secrets, there was a restaurant so small it had only 4 tables. The sign above the door read Lakshmi's Kitchen in fading paint, named for a woman who had died 2 years before her grandson learned to stand on a stool and reach the stove. Arjun had been cooking since he was 4 years old. Not playing at cooking, not pretending with toy pots and plastic vegetables, but actually cooking, standing beside his mother in the hours before dawn, learning to judge the heat of oil by the way it shimmered, understanding that cumin seeds bloom when they hit the pan at exactly the right temperature, discovering that food is a language older than words, and sometimes more honest. His mother, Priya, worked 3 jobs. In the morning, she cleaned offices in the business district, her hands moving efficiently over glass surfaces that reflected a city she would never quite belong to. In the afternoon, she returned to Lakshmi's Kitchen, the restaurant her mother had built, with borrowed money and impossible hope, trying to keep it alive even as the world kept insisting it should close. And at night, she sewed clothes for a tailor 2 streets over, her fingers moving in the lamplight while Arjun slept or pretended to sleep in the next room. She had learned not to dream too loudly. Dreams were expensive, and Priya had learned to budget everything, including hope. But Arjun dreamed anyway. He dreamed in flavors and textures, in the perfect balance of salt and sweet, in the way saffron could turn ordinary rice into something that tasted like celebration. He dreamed of his grandmother, whom he'd never met but knew through every recipe she'd left behind, handwritten in a notebook with grease-stained pages and margins filled with notes like, "Add more love," and "Cook until it smells like home." The casting call had come through a flyer someone had posted at the community center. A new show, they said. A cooking competition for young chefs. The winner would receive money for culinary school, equipment for their family restaurant, and a chance to cook on American television. Arjun had stared at that flyer for 3 days before he finally took it home to show his mother. "It's in America, Beta," she'd said softly, smoothing his hair back from his forehead the way she did when she was trying not to cry. "That's very far away. Grandmother's recipes should travel," he'd answered. And something in the way he said it, so certain, so quietly fierce, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, some dreams were worth the risk. The application process had been grueling. Video submissions, interviews, cooking demonstrations performed on their phone camera balanced precariously on a stack of cookbooks. And then, impossibly, acceptance. A plane ticket, a hotel room in Los Angeles that was larger than their entire apartment, a studio that gleamed like something from another planet. Arjun had won his preliminary rounds by cooking the things his grandmother had taught his mother, and his mother had taught him. Dal that tasted like patience, roti that required strong hands and stronger faith, fish curry that carried the memory of a coastline he'd only seen in photographs. The judges had praised his technique, his intuition, his ability to make them taste not just food, but story. And now here he was, standing on the Family Feud stage as part of a special episode featuring young culinary prodigies and their families. The format was simple. Answer questions, earn points, win money that would change everything. His mother sat in the audience, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She was wearing her best sari, the blue one she saved for weddings and temple visits, and her eyes hadn't left her son's face since the cameras started rolling. Steve Harvey had welcomed them with his characteristic warmth, making jokes that put everyone at ease, asking Arjun about his favorite dishes to cook, laughing when the child explained with perfect seriousness that breakfast was the most important meal because it set the tone for everything that followed. Then came the question. The simple, terrible question that would change everything. "Arjun, my man," Steve said, his smile wide and easy. "Tell me something. What's the one thing every great chef needs in their kitchen?" The question hung in the air like something physical, like you could reach out and touch it. A softball question, really. The kind designed to let a child shine, to say something cute about spatulas or good knives, or maybe if they were precocious, something about fresh ingredients or a chef's passion. Steve was already preparing his response, that practiced transition from their answer into the next phase of the game, the gentle ribbing he'd give before revealing whether their answer was on the board. Arjun looked down at his hands. Small hands, a child's hands, but marked with the tiny burns that come from years of standing too close to hot stoves because you're not tall enough to have a safe distance. His chef's hat tilted forward, and for a moment, everyone thought maybe he hadn't heard the question. The studio audience waited. The cameras held steady. Even the lighting felt suspended, as if the entire infrastructure of television production had taken a collective breath. When Arjun finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The sound engineer later said he'd never had to push levels that high for any contestant in the show's history. "My mother's hands," Arjun said. 4 words, simple, direct, and completely devastating. Steve's smile flickered, but he held it, professional as always. "Your mother's hands?" he repeated, thinking perhaps the child meant measuring by hand or the importance of manual skill. "That's beautiful, little man. Can you tell us more about that?" And that's when everything changed. Arjun looked up, and his eyes found his mother in the audience. She was crying already, though she was trying not to, one hand pressed against her mouth as if she could hold back the sob that wanted to escape. The camera found her face, and later, when this clip would go viral, accumulating millions of views in a matter of days, it would be this moment that people would pause on. This image of a mother watching her son speak a truth she'd hoped he didn't understand yet. "Every great chef needs my mother's hands," Arjun continued, his voice steadier now, as if he'd made a decision to be brave. "Because my mother's hands wake up at 4 in the morning every day to clean offices so I can go to cooking school. My mother's hands stir 50 kilos of rice every afternoon in our restaurant, even when they hurt so much she cries at night. My mother's hands sewed my chef's coat because we couldn't afford to buy one from the store, and she stayed up for 3 nights to make sure every stitch was perfect so I wouldn't be ashamed to wear it." The audience wasn't breathing anymore. Someone in the third row made a sound like a gasp and a sob combined. The cameras kept rolling because no one had told them to stop, and sometimes that's how miracles get captured, not through planning, but through the simple mechanical persistence of machines that don't know they're witnessing something holy. "My mother's hands," Arjun said, and now his own hands were gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles matched his mother's. "Held my grandmother's hands when she died, and then they opened her recipe book and taught themselves to cook all over again so my grandmother's food wouldn't die too. My mother's hands gave away food to people who couldn't pay because grandmother always said an empty stomach can't hear wisdom. My mother's hands," his voice cracked. 7 years old, standing under lights hot enough to make grown men sweat, and his voice finally cracked under the weight of loving someone that much. Steve Harvey's microphone was hanging at his side now, forgotten. His free hand had come up to cover his mouth, and his shoulders had begun to shake in that particular way that happens when you're trying very hard not to cry on national television and losing the battle. His eyes were squeezed shut, and when he opened them again, they were swimming. The studio had fallen into a silence so complete that you could hear the hum of the electrical systems, the whisper of the air conditioning, the rustle of 300 people trying desperately not to fall apart. One of the camera operators was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. A production assistant had her hand over her heart. Even the announcer, a man who'd worked in television for 30 years and prided himself on professional detachment, was standing in the wings with tears streaming down his face. Arjun wasn't finished. "Every great chef needs my mother's hands," he said, his voice small but unwavering now, as if he'd found some reservoir of strength that children shouldn't have to find. "Because my mother's hands are the reason I know what love tastes like. When you cook with love, people can taste it. Grandmother wrote that in her book. She said you can feel love in food the same way you can feel sunshine. And my mother's hands put love in everything, even when she's tired, even when we don't have enough money, even when she's scared. Especially then." He paused, and in that pause, time seemed to fold in on itself. The past and present occupied the same space, a grandmother in Mumbai who'd built something from nothing, a daughter who'd inherited impossible dreams, a grandson who carried them both in the way he spoke about the simplest, most profound thing in the world, the people who sacrifice everything so you can become yourself. "So that's my answer, sir," Arjun said to Steve Harvey, who was openly weeping now, not even trying to hide it anymore. "Every great chef needs hands like my mother's, hands that work, hands that love, hands that don't give up." The studio erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in a collective release of emotion that sounded like 300 people exhaling after holding their breath underwater. Tissues appeared from purses. Grown men who'd come to the studio expecting to laugh found themselves crying instead. And in the audience, Priya sat with her hands, those hands pressed against her face, her entire body shaking with sobs she'd held back for years, maybe decades, maybe her entire life. Steve Harvey stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. Television time moves differently than real time, and in moments like this, it stops altogether. He looked at Arjun, then at Priya, then back at Arjun. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, shook his head as if trying to clear it. "Hold on," he finally managed, his voice thick and rough. "Just hold on a second." He set his microphone down on the podium. Actually set it down. Something he'd never done in the middle of a live taping in his entire career. He walked away from his mark, off his designated spot on the stage, and the cameras followed him uncertainly as he moved toward the audience. The director was frantically gesturing to the camera operators, trying to figure out what was happening, whether to cut to commercial, whether to intervene. But Steve Harvey wasn't following anyone's direction anymore. He was following something older and truer than television production schedules. He found Priya in the third row. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. This woman who'd worked 3 jobs and crossed an ocean and sewn her son's dreams with her own scarred fingers. Steve Harvey, this giant of American entertainment, this man who'd built an empire on laughter and timing and perfect one-liners, knelt down in the aisle beside her seat. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried through the studio microphones even though he wasn't holding one anymore. "Ma'am, I need to know if it's okay if I give your son a hug." Priya nodded, unable to speak, and Steve Harvey stood and walked back to the stage. Arjun was still standing at the podium, his chef's hat askew now, his small face wet with tears. Steve opened his arms, and the child walked into them, and the entire studio, the crew, the audience, the producers in the control room watched as one of television's biggest personalities held a 7-year-old boy and just let him cry. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," Steve whispered, but the microphones caught it anyway. "And your mama, son, your mama is a queen. Do you know that? She's a queen." The commercial break that was supposed to happen at minute 2:30 didn't come. The director made a call. "Let it play. Let this moment breathe. Let it be what it needs to be." When Steve finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Arjun's shoulders and looked directly into the camera. "We're going to take a minute here," he said to America, to the world, to anyone watching. "Because what just happened, this ain't about a game show anymore." When the cameras came back and there was real debate in the control room about whether they should come back at all, whether some moments are too sacred for broadcast, Steve Harvey was sitting on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side like a man who'd forgotten he was supposed to be standing at a podium hosting a television show. Arjun sat beside him, the wooden box that had elevated him to podium height now serving as a seat. Their feet didn't touch the ground. A 67-year-old entertainment legend and a 7-year-old chef from Mumbai, suspended together in a moment that had nothing to do with television and everything to do with being human. The studio lights had been dimmed slightly. Someone in production had made that call, understanding instinctively that this moment needed softer edges, gentler illumination. The audience sat in a kind of reverent stillness, the sort that usually only exists in churches or at bedsides or in those rare spaces where people remember what actually matters. Steve was holding the recipe book. Arjun had asked his mother to bring it to him, and Priya had walked down the aisle with shaking hands to deliver it this small, grease-stained notebook that contained a grandmother's legacy written in cramped handwriting and fading ink. Steve turned the pages carefully, reverently, as if he understood he was holding something holy. "Add more love," he read aloud, his voice still rough from crying. "Your grandmother wrote that right here in the margin, next to this dal recipe. Cook until it smells like home. Son, do you know what that smells like? Home?" Arjun nodded. "It smells like safety, sir, and like someone is waiting for you, and like tomorrow might be okay even if today was hard." The simplicity of it landed like a punch. You could hear it ripple through the audience, that collective intake of breath that happens when a child speaks truth so pure it cuts through every defense adults have built around their hearts. Steve closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he wasn't looking at Arjun anymore. He was looking out at the audience, at the cameras, at everyone watching, and something in his face had shifted. The professional mask had fallen away completely. What remained was just Steve, not the comedian, not the host, not the brand, but the man underneath all of it. The man who'd grown up poor in Cleveland, who'd slept in his car chasing dreams, who understood in his bones what it meant to have someone believe in you when you had no logical reason to believe in yourself. "I want to tell you all something," he said, and his voice carried the weight of confession. 43 years I've been doing this. 43 years of television, of making people laugh, of playing the game, of keeping the show moving. And I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I understood what this work was for." He paused, shaking his head slowly. "But this young man just taught me something I should have known all along. This ain't about the game. This ain't about the points on that board or the money or the laughs or the ratings. This is about seeing each other, really seeing each other. This is about recognizing that every single person standing in front of us has a story, has a mama who sacrificed, has hands that worked in the dark, has dreams that somebody else paid for." Priya was weeping openly in her seat, but she was also smiling, that complicated expression that happens when grief and gratitude occupy the same space in the human heart. Several audience members had reached over to hold her hands. These strangers who'd come to watch a game show and found themselves part of something else entirely. Steve turned back to Arjun. "Your mama's hands," he said softly. "You know what I see when I look at your mama's hands?" Arjun shook his head. "I see my mama's hands," Steve said. And now he was crying again, but differently, not with shock or overwhelm, but with recognition. "I see every mother who ever worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, who ever went without so their babies could have. I see every woman who ever believed in a dream she'd never see come true herself, but planted it anyway in her child's heart like a seed." He stood up, and his movements were slow, deliberate, like a man in church approaching an altar. He walked over to Priya, and the cameras followed, and 300 people watched as Steve Harvey, this tower of success and achievement and hard-won triumph, knelt again in that aisle. "Ma'am, may I see your hands?" he asked. Priya extended them, trembling, these hands that had scrubbed floors and stirred pots and sown dreams and buried mothers. Steve took them gently in his own, and he just held them there for a moment, looking at them like they were ancient texts he was trying to read. "These hands," he said, and his voice broke over the words. "These are the hands that built everything. Not just your son's dreams, everything that matters in this world gets built by hands like these. Hands that love more than they rest. Hands that give more than they take. Hands that work in the dark so someone else can stand in the light." He looked up at her face. "You are not just a mother, ma'am. You are a miracle. You are proof that God still believes in us." The studio had become a sanctuary. That's the only word for it. Somewhere along the way, without anyone planning it or scripting it or orchestrating it, the space had transformed. The game show set with its bright colors and buzzers and scoreboards had become a place of witness, of testimony, of healing that happens when people dare to tell the truth about love and sacrifice and the mathematics of giving everything. Steve helped Priya to her feet and walked her up to the stage. Mother and son stood together under those lights, and Steve stood beside them, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The silence was full, pregnant with everything that didn't need words, everything that language can't quite hold. Then Steve did something that would become legendary in television history. He turned to the director and made a cutting motion across his throat. "Kill the game. Stop the show." This moment was more important than points or prizes or scheduled programming. "Here's what we're gonna do," he announced to the studio, to the cameras, to everyone watching at home. "We're not gonna finish this game. We're gonna do something better. We're gonna make sure this young man and his mama have everything they need to keep their grandmother's dream alive." He looked directly into the camera. "I'm talking to you, America. I'm talking to everyone watching this. If you've got a restaurant in your city that's struggling, if you know a mother working 3 jobs, if you see people like this every day, and you walk past them, stop, see them, help them. Because that could be your mama. That could be your kid. That could be you." The audience rose to its feet. Not in applause, not yet, but in solidarity, in recognition, in the kind of standing that happens when people realize they've been part of something they'll tell their grandchildren about. Arjun looked up at his mother, and she looked down at him, and between them passed a conversation that needed no words. Steve Harvey watched them, and in his eyes, you could see the reflection of every sacrifice his own mother had made, every meal she'd stretched, every dream she'd protected with her life. "Your grandmother is here," Steve whispered to Arjun. "You know that, right? She's right here, watching you, and she's so proud she can barely stand it." Arjun nodded, and when he smiled through his tears, it looked like sunrise. The episode aired 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night. The network had debated whether to show it at all. It didn't follow the format, didn't deliver the laughs that advertisers had paid for, didn't resolve with the neat efficiency that television demands. But something in the footage made them reconsider. Maybe it was the way Steve Harvey's voice cracked when he spoke about mothers and miracles. Maybe it was Arjun's face when he talked about hands that worked in darkness. Maybe it was simply the truth of it, raw and unpolished and real, in a way that scripted television could never replicate. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed 30 million times. Comments flooded in from every corner of the world, from mothers who'd worked night shifts and day shifts and every shift in between, from children who finally understood what their parents had given up, from strangers who admitted they'd been walking past miracles their whole lives without stopping to see them. The video was shared in languages Steve Harvey didn't speak, subtitled into dialects he'd never heard of, watched in villages and cities and quiet rooms where people sat alone with their phones and remembered everyone who'd ever loved them enough to sacrifice. But the numbers don't tell the real story. They never do. The real story is what happened to Lakshmi's kitchen in the months that followed. Donations arrived from around the world, not millions, not the kind of viral fundraising that makes headlines, but steady, persistent gifts from people who understood what it meant to keep a dream alive on borrowed time and stubborn faith. $1,000 from a teacher in Ohio, $500 from a doctor in Singapore, $20 from a college student in Brazil who sent a note that said simply, "For your mother's hands." The restaurant expanded, not into something unrecognizable, but into a fuller version of itself. A few more tables, a new stove, equipment that didn't break down every third Tuesday. Priya hired 2 employees, women from the neighborhood who needed work, who needed to believe that hands like theirs still had value in a world that often overlooked them. The recipe book, Lakshmi's Grease-Stained Legacy, was photographed and preserved and eventually published a small run, nothing fancy, but enough that grandmothers on the other side of the world could cook dal that tasted like Mumbai, like memory, like love transcribed into spices and heat. Arjun continued cooking. He appeared on other shows, won other competitions, collected scholarships and opportunities that would have seemed impossible just months before. But what people noticed most wasn't his technique or his accolades. It was the way he talked about food, the way he insisted that cooking was an act of love before it was anything else. The way he mentioned his mother and his grandmother in every interview, like they were the real story and he was just the messenger. Steve Harvey never forgot. He called Priya on her birthday that first year, then the second, then every year after. Just to check in, he said. Just to remind her that what she'd done, the way she'd loved, the way she'd sacrificed, the way she'd built something beautiful with tired hands and unbreakable faith, mattered more than she knew. He featured their story in his motivational talks, his sermons, his quiet conversations with people who needed to hear that persistence and love could still change the world. And the audience from that day, those 300 people who'd come expecting a game show and witnessed something closer to grace, they carried it with them too. They told their children about the afternoon they watched a 7-year-old boy teach a legend about love. They thought about it when their own mothers called, when their own children needed them, when the work felt too hard and the sacrifice felt too heavy. They remembered that somewhere, a woman's hands had built a world, and somewhere, a child had been brave enough to tell the truth about it. The episode won awards, not the kind given at glitzy ceremonies, but the kind that matter more. Messages from viewers who said it saved their marriages, their relationships with their parents, their faith in people. Letters from mothers who'd been ready to give up and decided to hold on for one more day. Notes from children who finally called home. Sometimes television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes, in those rare and sacred moments when the cameras catch something true, it holds up a mirror to the best parts of ourselves. The parts that love harder than logic, that sacrifice more than seems possible, that build entire worlds with nothing but faith and tired hands, and the stubborn insistence that tomorrow can be different if we're brave enough to make it so. And somewhere out there, in a kitchen that smells like cumin and hope, and the memory of grandmothers who believed in impossible things, a small boy stands on a stool and cooks like love is the only ingredient that matters, because he learned from hands that proved it was.